Muma was former commissioner as well with Kamodo at the CIC, but more importantly, she was a member of what was officially known as the Independent Review Electoral Commission, the Independent Review Commission, which is mostly known as the Krigler Commission. Abdikadir Mohammed is the president's legal advisor and on constitutional matters as well. And if you remember, he was the inaugural chair, if I'm not wrong, of the CIOC in Parliament. Barak Muluka, very well known to many of us, historian. This man understands this country perhaps more than very many of us. Thank you very much, ladies, gentlemen. And in fact, it is with Barak that I will begin. In March 1957, Africans were allowed for the first time to participate in elections. Here we are now, 60 years later. Every election is contentious. Why?
Yes, thank you. I think when you look at it through the historical prism, what you witness is dominance. That in 1957, or rather 1947, you are talking about Africans starting to come on board for the first time as elected members. And before that, you have seen that Africans have been agitating for representation, resulting into what has gone down in history as the Devonshire White Paper of 1923. And at that time, Africans are represented by a bishop who is nominated by the colonial governor to represent African interests. So what you are seeing at that time is a colonial racist hegemony. And the story is the same right across the continent of Africa, that we are talking about hegemonistic regimes that try to wear a democratic garb and to look like we are talking about democracy and about elections, but it's about certain dominant sections of society, of the population trying to establish themselves as dominant groups over others, people who believe that they must rule, and therefore you find that all the systems, the instruments and the forums are very clearly choreographed to lead to a predetermined kind of outcome. And that's why you have in Africa people ruling for 30 years, 25 years. Now we've got people who have been in power for almost 40 years.
And we will get to that, and, you know, systems that you've talked about and fora. But yet it still seems like the more things change, the more they remain the same. We put in place laws, we put in place systems and processes, like he's talking about, Abdikadir. So what is it? Is it the law that's the problem? You were responsible for implementing the 2010 Constitution that's now, what, 6 years old?
7.
What is it? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't think we have a problem with the laws generally. I think we have good laws. I think we have a problem with our culture in terms of the issues at hand, which is our political culture. We tried very hard to answer some of the questions Barak pointed out. Most of the struggles are about resources and about political power. And we've tried as much as possible to answer those through Katiba 2010, so that you could disperse power, you could have power as close to the populace as possible, and you could also disperse resources as much as possible. We also tried, even though we might not have succeeded, to look at some other thing that is very much part of the African political scene, which is ethnicity, which is the fact that our politics is organized around our ethnic groups. It doesn't matter whether you're very well educated, whether you are male or female, whether you are rich or poor. Most likely you'll vote with your ethnic group at a certain level, whether it's at the MCA level or the MP or large majorities of the presidential candidate's ethnic group will vote for him or her. So we tried to see whether we can force through some requirement for ethnic inclusion in many of our institutions. And these were fairly new in constitutions. Most African constitutions assumed there was nothing like ethnicity, while in fact it was really the main potent force in our politics. So we tried very hard to answer to some of those questions. Some bits we have succeeded, like devolution. Even though we have a struggle at the national level, national executive, we have devolved units that have executives that belong to NASA or Jubilee. Mombasa is run by NASA. Nairobi is now run by Jubilee. Kisumu is run by NASA. Garissa by Jubilee, so that power is not necessarily only at the center, but we have a long way to go as things.
Yeah, and you mentioned the interesting thing about power being not so much at the center, and now I know devolution we've only had sort of round one of it and are now just starting the second phase, but the president isn't as powerful as he was before. There's now devolution. It was expected that people would now focus on their governors and at that level, yet the presidential poll still remains contentious, Catherine. Why?
I still think the point made by Honorable Abdikadir on the contest of tribes is actually our kind of politics. And because of that, it's a do or die contest. And I have never seen it this bad. Professionals divided alongside the tribe, analysis of issues that are straightforward, divided along tribe, literally. One tribe thinks this particular issue should go this way, and the other tribes think it should go the other way. I think maybe the electoral system that we have, first past the post, winner takes it all, may be part of the problem. Maybe we should have come up, honestly discussed the best way to have an equitable share of not just the devolved governance system, but also the power at the national level.
Yeah.
If we did that,
how would we do that?
Maybe through proportional representation that actually picks the face of Kenya, so that when we are voting, we would perhaps vote.
You know, this face of Kenya that we keep hearing about, how possible is it? We've got 44 tribes right now. Abdikadir wants to weigh in before I come to you, Kamodo.
Yeah, and we tried actually in requiring, for example, 50% plus one for you to be elected president.
Right, and 25% in half the counties.
And then winning in the majority of the counties.
Yeah.
So the push is towards that. But as you said, ultimately at the presidential level, you would have one president. You would have one president. And hopefully you have representatives at the MCA level, you have representatives at members of parliament level, you have representatives at county governors level and senators level. So I think the representation bit, we are, in fact, there are people who think we might be overrepresented. So I think that we have tried to answer in terms of how do we get to represent people at that side. And as you say, at the presidential level, we will have to have one person. And he or she has to belong to one community or the other.
Right, yeah, naturally. So do we have a rotational presidency, Kamodo? Will that solve our problem? Let's not have an election at that level. Although maybe one community might have to wait, how many election cycles before they see their person at the helm? Because sometimes it just feels like we need a solution that's, out there.
I think it's a journey. I think we are very impatient with our country, and sometimes we don't recognize that the process of making a nation is sometimes a very painful and sometimes tragic one. But I think the question is whether we're moving forwards or we're moving backwards. And like Catherine, I actually don't think that we've actually become worse. You see, traditionally, the fight around elections was primarily driven by the fight for equity in resource allocation. Yes. I think we have a reasonably more rule-based system. I don't think we are fully there, but I think we have a more rule-based system that, fairly distributes resources generally in an equitable manner. Even in terms of, because the other issue is always about access to opportunity. even access to opportunity, I think there's a level in which we have distributed that, to some measure. If you look at the counties, and I think I won't go into that, I think my colleagues talked about that. But even you look at national institutions, the judiciary itself, you look at the judiciary now as a second arm of government, you find it's fairly, it's a fair reflection of the, that face of Kenya. If you look at the legislature, it is at the executive. And even at the executive, we're actually talking about the top. And part of the reality of that is that I think why we're feeling the intensity of this conversation is that the people who are complaining now are the people who feel excluded at the level of that national executive. That very small space that we have created, in which everyone is looking at, and we are all competing to get there. And I think that's going to be a very difficult one to resolve. For as long as our politics are going to revolve around ethnicities, the reality is that that top national executive, because a small one, is going to be fairly reflective of a particular leaning that is defined to some extent ethnically. So for as long as we do not move our politics from defined by tribe, that clamor for that space at the top, defined ethnically, is going to be there.
And how do we start to define our politics without using the word, ethnics? And let me be open here, because I hope we can be as open as we possibly can tonight. There's lots of Kenyans out there that say, well, the presidency has been occupied by members of just 2 communities since 1963. Perhaps that might be the sense of exclusion that Kamotho might be talking about. But is that really a problem, Barak? Do you think that's a sentiment that's widely shared? People saying, but why just those 2? There's Turukanas, there's Samburus, there's Njemps, there's all manner of people that can get to the top, yet 2 only over the last 50 years.
Yes, I think it's a congenital problem, but allow me first to correct myself. You're right, it's 1957 when we had the first 8 elected African members of the Legislative Council, and that we saw those 8 members representing regions, and that indeed even this challenge of ethnicity began emerging that early, because if you can think of only 8 representing all the regions in Kenya, you can begin appreciating the kinds of contestations that arose, and that at independence, when we are going to Lancaster, in 1960, all the way to 1962, it's the question of ethnicity that is at the heart of the negotiation of what kind of constitution we should go to independence with. And that question of ethnic dominance was discussed very candidly, very openly, where you found that the tribes that were within KANU, dominantly Kikuyu and Luo, were sending shivers across the rest of the communities. And they were saying, we don't want to go into an independent nation state where we are going to be dominated by 2 communities. As things would turn out, those 2 communities and the political architects there are able to persuade those who were in KADU and who actually had carried the day at Lancaster and brought independence on a federalist constitution, that they should cross over into KANU. And so the challenge of domination begins. And it's not about to go away. Kamotho may be right that we are talking about a fairly small and presidency and national government and the like, but it is also true that it's not just the cabinet that we are talking about. It's not just the principal secretaries you're talking about the whole architecture of government at that level. And if you just keep on seeing that the names in government, when they say the chairman of the tourism board from Emanyudia, when they talk about the managing director of Kenya Railways from Emanyudia, when they come to the next person from the treasury from Emanyudia, then people start getting concerned. And so it behooves those who are up there to actually do all they can to give their government a national outlook. If they don't do that, these problems are not about to go away.
Siasa mbaya, maisha mbaya is a phrase that we heard quite a bit when KANU was in power. And Kamoto is talking about we've made an effort towards redistributing the resources of the country, but there's still the feeling that the person who's in State House will control where resources go. Have we sorted out this historical problem in this country over successive administrations to a point where for people it wouldn't necessarily matter who lives in State House?
Yeah, so that's a very important office, and in every country it's a critical office, whether it's the most developed democracies right now, and the contestations may not necessarily be on ethnic basis; it could be on dogma or other political philosophy. So the office will always be important. Now, have we made a serious effort? Absolutely, yes. I think sometimes we are too hard on ourselves as a country. We are more cynical than most other places. In the region, for example, I think we have, not even in the region, actually internationally, we have tried very hard to respond to our problems through reforms, through action that is very reasonably aimed at these issues. So we've looked at most of the issues we have. We have a problem with the resource allocation. That's true in most countries in the world. We have tried to sort that out through a framework. That is devolution and many other things. We have required by law that we should have the face of Kenya in many of our institutions, including the military. If you look at our constitution, it says even in the military, the top hierarchy should be the face of Kenya. So, there is serious effort in each of those things. In most of the jobs, which usually are dished out by president or by the chief executive, we have required for there to be advertisement and for people to apply. In many of times, we have even moved it from the executive and put it in the hands of ad hoc panels so that there is a bit of... So there's a serious effort at that.
But yet people are still unhappy even with good laws.
And people will be unhappy because we haven't reached... We're still a poor... African nation.
We are not poor, certainly
in terms of our economy. In terms of our economy, yes, we are, because look at our per capita. If you look at our per capita, it's nowhere near what we don't have the resources to give each of our people jobs. We need to go there. No doubt about that. But we have done substantial effort, and we have moved that needle.
Have we? Catherine?
I think constitutionally and legally, we can say we have very good laws. Do we implement those laws as expected? We are struggling on doing what the Constitution says we should do. We are struggling on implementing the laws that have been put in place to guide us. So I think we have a problem of lawlessness, if I can use that word. It seems harsh, but I think we have set institutions, independent institutions, given them the mandates, given them the tenure, but we still have problems.
Are they independent?
They are independent, but they are
in law. Are they independent?
I think the institutions are as good as the people in those institutions.
Okay.
So if we give you independence, but you choose not to be independent.
I think the problem is not the people. The problem is systemic. Otherwise, we are going to keep on changing people. Look at what we have had with the IBC, for example. You can bring in different people. You still continue having
what's the problem?
The same problems.
Are the laws
the problem is this. Let me put it very plainly.
Yes, please.
That we have got what is essentially a monarchical order, a monarchical attitude, and that this monarchist system is trying to put on a garb of democracy. So you put in place institutions, systems, and instruments that are at crossroads, are at cross purposes with what the dominant forces within the society would like to see. That is why in a situation such as where we are in Kenya today, you find that all the instruments of state state control are aligned to ensure that they are delivering what the hegemonistic, despotic system would like to see in place. However,
you're getting everyone excited on the panel, Barak.
Yes, because they must hear this truth. However, you find that sometimes there's the odd man out, and in this context, it is the judiciary. The judiciary is refusing to be that last piece of the jigsaw puzzle that is supposed to fall in place. And so we must draw a clear distinction between form on the one hand and content, context, and function. That all these things are supposed to deliver a certain function, and that function is the perpetuation of a despotic system that looks like it's a democratic system.
I think there's a lot. I think let's be realistic. I think the truth of the matter is, we created a monster for 50 years, but somehow we expect that with the same people. Yeah, the monster of the country that we created, and that brought us almost to war in 2007, because it was a system that excluded people. It was a system that was inequitable. It took us 50 years to get there. It has taken us 5 or 6 years to try and undo that. But somehow we expect that in that 1 year, we have a perfect system. It's not going to be perfect. In fact, the contradiction of what Barak is saying is recognizing that in 7 years, we have actually created an independent judiciary that can face the presidency. But we don't recognize that these are things that are going to take time. If you look at the problems even of resource distribution, there are very few countries that come from a patronage system of resource distribution from where we came from to one where our parliament actually determines how resources go. And resources are based on rules. You cannot go this far. That is a process for many democracies that takes a very long time. But I think we still see this country through the shades of the Constitution. And instead of seeing how we can move ahead,
could it be possible that pre-Constitution mentality and order still remains even in a new regime? And by the way,
it remains even with our analysts. We assume as if nothing has happened. And so we still craft Kenya, we still draw it with the pre-Constitution. Does it mean the Constitution is perfect? Have we delivered on it? I am with Catherine completely. There are many things we haven't done, but I don't think the solution is to assume that let's recreate this country anew. This one has failed, let's do another one. No. I think there are certain things we can build on. The judiciary may make mistakes, and I'm one of those who will admit there are times even on a decision like the one that they made, people may disagree with the decision. But the reality is that the price we would pay if we kill the judiciary is more expensive than the effect of their mistake. So it is to say, let us strengthen what we have. Let us not keep undoing the country and assuming that we're going to resolve it through new rules. We're not going to. The rules we have are okay. Let's find a way of strengthening them.
Right. Yvonne, allow me to make my point.
Yeah.
I think a system is not some abstract feature that is somewhere that just runs on its own. It is actually run by people. And talking elections, I think we've given the election management body the necessary constitutional freedom, constitutional independence, constitutional direction. If you read chapter 7, it talks about both system and process. Detailed rules, regulations that can enable it to carry out a credible election. So to the extent that they fail to do that, they cannot blame it on somebody somewhere.
Catherine knows very well that this notion of independence within the IBC, and indeed in the so-called independent bodies, is a fiction. That these people are appointed by political parties. Political parties nominate. They say that we will have so many. Look at this IBC, the way it is populated today. We know who was taken there by CORD. We know who was taken there by Jubilee. How do you start even remotely talking about independence?
So how do we ensure their independence?
What is the independence is in law. Actually, it is not in practice.
It's not in practice.
Actually, I disagree with Barak. There is no country on earth that sources members of its electoral management body the way we do. Nowhere. How do you get the IBC people? You don't get them. In most countries, election management is done by the central government. It's done by the Ministry of Interior. maybe with some support from their local authorities, like in the UK. In our case, what we do is we form an ad hoc committee made up of religious people, civil society types, and representation from political parties. That team is sent to Parliament for vetting. The team that's supposed to do the advertisement is sent to Parliament for vetting. Parliament vets. Then they advertise publicly and oftentimes hold their interviews publicly. The people they source are then sent to the president and back to Parliament. There's no other country that goes through that. Let me finish here, Barack. There's no that goes through that. Number one. Number two, you can't have your cake and eat it. We either have democratic institutions, respect them, or we have the other systems of government. And the others work also. And they are monarchs, and I've seen them. We know where the monarchs are, and you would not have the independent media we have when you have a monarchy. You would not have the independent judiciary we have. You will not have independent electoral management bodies that don't get to be. Even PSs have to go through the Public Service Commission. Our Chief Justice gets to be appointed through advertisement. So I think we have made substantial strides.
Okay.
Now, I agree with Catherine in one sense.
See,
I agree with
You'll get a moment,
Catherine in what sense? When you are given a job to do, you go and do it.
So why don't we have people that do the job, and now they're independent, or or so we say, also the Constitution says.
So we used to have the Nairobi City. Let me the county government. But when we used to have the Nairobi City Council, right?
Yes.
And we used to have the Central Bank of Kenya. And those two institutions were less than a kilometer and a half apart, but they were worlds apart. So we have institutions that work, and we have institutions that don't work. And the institutions that work are made to work by people.
All right.
So, for example, if I was Chebukati, what excuse do I have? What excuse do I have for not working?
The excuse you have is that if you work, the executive will fix you.
Where is that fixed?
Have we not had, for example, the executive saying that it is going to fix the judiciary? Yes, and they've said that from rooftops. We have seen that there is a legislature that is actually trying to fix the judiciary. It is trying to fix the IBC.
That's all.
It's trying to.
Yeah, I think institutions need to work. I think institutions need to work. And believe you me, they know. They have run through an institution that works.
Okay. I want us to take a short break, and then we will come back with our discussion. Abdikadir, you advise the executive on legal and constitutional affairs. Are the laws in this country now, with respect to elections, adequate as they are?
No. So you ask an important question, and I suspect the issue is on the bill that is before Parliament.
Yeah.
Now, my view is we have good laws, even before the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court decision put our laws in a flux. It raised a number of issues. Usually when issues are raised, either through a court process or elsewhere. So, for example, in corporate law, we had Enron. I don't know whether you were around when Enron happened in the US, and the reaction to Enron is a very famous act.
Yes.
Called the Sabins Act. So the Sabins Act came in because it was a reaction to Enron. So usually when you have a major issue, one of the ways to resolve it, or one of the ways to address it or implement it, is through legislative action, because the court spoke to very many laws. Some of them it said were not clear. So, for example,
did it speak to the ineffectiveness of the law, or its adherence?
It was about process.
It was about process on your part?
So, for example, in one particular, in Section 83, and Catherine knows, there are two parts of that particular section. And there was a lot of discussion as to whether the two parts were joined so this and this, or whether they were completely separate and to be treated separately. So one of the things Parliament trying to do is answer that question. Because what was the court trying to say? What did Parliament mean by using the term or? Did they mean to completely separate the two parts or join? So usually it's up to Parliament, because the court is interpreting, obviously on the basis of the Constitution, but interpreting parliamentary intent.
Okay.
So I really don't see any major issue with that. And if you look at them, really, they are very simple clarifications and stuff.
All right, clarifications. Catherine, I know you want to
I have
weigh
an
in.
issue. One,
do you share the same view?
I don't share the same view. And if you look at our Elections Act, the Election Offences Act, and read it in detail, we have enough laws to actually conduct a free, fair, credible election. And what the Supreme Court said is that the process that was in place was not followed. So go back and follow it. Now, what the current amendments are trying to do, in my view, is to try and regularize the conduct that was found to be irregular by the Supreme Court, which in my view amounts to a coup against the Constitution. So I think we need to look at the detail of that.
I think
like the offenses, if you look at I think everybody keeps talking about the offense of the PO going to being jailed.
Yeah.
That's already provided for. There is an offense about the PO not doing, electoral officers not doing what they're supposed to do. So I don't know what value that is adding. If you talk about the electoral management body being split into this quorum of 3, that is interfering with an independent institution.
But
actually let me just finish. You're trying to, Parliament is trying to actually run the process of an independent institution.
Okay.
If you talk about the Supreme Court decision having a number of people, that is Parliament trying to make a decision.
Let me say something, Yvonne.
It's in 30 seconds because we must take a break.
There's something we forget. In all our electoral processes, we amend laws. You know, by the way, 8 months before this election of 2013, we actually amended electoral laws. There is nothing strange. About 3 weeks before the elections, minor KI decision fundamentally altered the elections law. So there is nothing magical about changing the law.
Well, nothing magical,
but
some would contest.
Suspicion. You see, because we are very suspicious. If you support a particular wing, you will be suspicious of these laws. If you will support, so that is a problem. So we are not even actually looking at the content of the law, because we already imagine these laws are intended to achieve a nefarious object. That is part of the problem.
Okay, so trust has come up to be a major issue in this country with respect to elections. We have much more to discuss with you, ladies and gentlemen. We will get to that, including a tweet by Frederick Okango who says, perhaps we should restore the country to factory settings. I don't know what that means, but we will talk about that and a lot more. And we did at some point, at least as far as elections goes. We will be speaking to Catherine about whether we did that with the Kriegler Commission and why we seem to need to restore to factory settings. And by the way, factory settings, back to colonialism and some of the things that they put in place pre-colonial. If we can have institutional memory of that time, perhaps we will carry on with this conversation. Obviously, you can see not consensus, but important points nonetheless. Thank you very much. We will continue with this discussion, but we will be right back right here on Check.